Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Fifth Child Podcast, the weekly podcast where I, Chris, give you two different recommendations either for video games, movies, anime, television series, or whatever. So, unfortunately, I made another oopsie. Now, I had originally thought that I updated the newest episode from last week during Friday morning. As it turns out, I must have misjudged that, because apparently I did not upload it. I could have sworn that I uploaded it to YouTube and had it scheduled at that right time, but it turns out that I didn't actually do that, so I just ended up having to re-upload it on Monday morning. So that episode's at least out there. I'm sorry that I've been getting kind of irregular with my scheduling, but again, this viewership's a little small right now anyways, that I don't think anyone would really notice a difference, hopefully if this podcast gets bigger. But I want to thank you guys so much for coming back in and listening to this week's podcast episode. If you want to listen to more of this, please make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Make sure to talk about in the comment section what you would like me to talk about in the next episode, and so on and so forth like that. So for the rest of the month, I have my little ideas of exactly what I want to talk about. For those of you who are not aware of this, there's a new Pokemon game that's coming out this week. I'm dating this episode by when it's coming out, obviously, by saying that. By the time that this episode comes out, I will likely have Pokemon Sword in my hands. I decided to go for the Sword version. Sword just sounded cooler to me, and I think I like the exclusives more. I'm a little bit wary about the game, to be honest. The more and more I hear about this game, the more it really feels like a step forward, the more it feels like a couple steps forward, but also a couple steps back at the same time. This always seems like a big trend going on with most of the Pokemon games ever since Pokemon Black. For those of you who are not aware, I'm a big Pokemon fan. I've been a big fan since Pokemon Red and Blue and the television series that was based on the video games. So I've always been a big fan of the Pokemon series at heart, and the last game I played in the series, the Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu game for the Nintendo Switch, was personally one of my favorite times playing a Pokemon game, just the main story, and the game had enough post-game content that I still enjoy going back to it every now and again, just to level up my Pokemon more, battle against like the master Pokemon trainers or whatever that's in the post game. So I really liked Pokemon Let's Go. I think it's a pretty neat step in the right direction that does a good job at reinventing the series, and I'd like to see what they could do more with that kind of scale of game. But with Sword and Shield, there's a lot of iffy things going on with the release of that game, and some interesting PR practices by the publisher and developer Game Freak that I'm not too keen on, honestly. If you haven't been following along with the entire snafu with Pokemon Sword and Shield, as it turns out, at least half of the Pokemon in the Pokedex have been removed from the National Pokedex. So in a Pokemon game, there's the Pokedex, which is your encyclopedia of all the Pokemon, the pocket monsters that you've collected throughout the game. Throughout the entire game. And as the entire series has gone on, we're currently on our 8th generation right now. That National Pokedex has been growing larger and larger and larger, and as a Sword and Shield, that Pokedex has been cut nearly in half, which unfortunately means that a lot of my personal favorite Pokemon are not actually in Sword and Shield, which kind of sucks a little bit. So I'm interested to see what Sword and Shield's going to be like. I've already pre-ordered the game. It's going to come to me on Friday. I'm interested to play it. I can't wait to play it. It's Pokemon, so I'll take it whatever I can get. It just kind of sucks, just from what I'm hearing, that this isn't the big step forward in the franchise that I think we were all hoping it to be. Again, this has happened multiple times before. I personally always believe that Pokemon X and Y was a good step forward in the right direction, but didn't quite have exactly what it needed to push itself to a new level. And then Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, which was the remakes of Generation 3 Pokemon, was one of my personal favorite remakes in the Pokemon series ever. And then we also got Pokemon Sun and Moon, which were fantastic games when they first came out. And then I heard Ultra Sun and Moon were pretty good too, even though I haven't actually played it. That's the one Pokemon game that I haven't actually played. So I'm interested to see what Pokemon Sword and Shield has in store. So hopefully expect to hear from that maybe next week's episode. Even if I don't finish the game, I do want to talk about it. But for this week's podcast episode, this is going to be a pretty light podcast episode. This is going to be what I like to consider a catch-up episode. So in this catch-up episode, I don't actually have a new game from 2019 I want to talk about. I actually wanted to go back and talk about a game that came out in 2018 that I finally got around to playing. Besides that, I also don't have a movie television series in specific I want to talk about, but I do actually want to give you something interesting. Because like I said in previous podcast episodes, we're getting a new Star Wars movie, and I debated about whether or not I wanted to talk about every single Star Wars episode, every single Star Wars movie, and what my general thoughts are on them, either talking about the prequel trilogy, the sequel trilogy, and the original trilogy, either in their own little podcast episodes. I think it'd be I think I would much rather actually talk about the episodes in a ranked format and actually talk about my personal favorite Star Wars movies and rank them based on which ones are my least favorite and which ones were my personal favorite. So I'm going to talk about that. But first, I'm going to go ahead and actually talk about the video game I want to talk about for today. This won't go too quick because there's not much about this game I really want to spoil, because I think this is a game that if it hasn't been spoiled for you already, you need to play this game, and that is the 2018 remake / sequel reboot of God of War. God of War is a hack and slash adventure game that was created by Santa Monica Studios, which is a second party developer for Sony, and they're obviously well known for the God of War series. To kind of give a little bit of a primer on the God of War series, to the scope that is relevant to this game, the God of War series is based around a main character known as Kratos. Kratos is a warrior of Sparta, which is one of the great warrior tribes and countries of ancient Greek. And then the entirety of God of War 1, 2, and 3 is Kratos slowly ascending into power and exacting revenge on all the Greek gods that have wronged him throughout the ages, whether it be Ares, the original God of War, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, and plenty of the other gods and goddesses that have wronged him throughout his lifetime. And the entire trilogy of God of War is a cycle of violence that is never ending, and this is where this game takes place in. So this game is chronologically the latest game in the series, and it also serves as a big step forward for the franchise in a different direction. While the original God of War series I would classify as hack and slash games, which are very similar to the Devil May Cry series, the Bayonetta series, in a much more brutal fashion that isn't really so focused on style, but more on complete and sheer brutality. This new game in the series is actually more of an open-worlded action-adventure with some mild hack-and-slash elements to it, with also with a pretty intricate role-playing game system added to it as well. The biggest difference, though, in this entire game is also the story. So the main story of God of War takes place many years after the third game in the series, when Kratos had finally exacted his revenge on Zeus, who, big spoiler for the original God of War trilogy, is actually the father of Kratos. Kratos decides to settle down and try to find a peaceful life away from all the violence he had taken part of. He falls in love with a woman. He falls in love with a woman who lives in the Nordic countries, and then eventually has a child named Atreus. And the game picks up at the very, very beginning with you don't get to see it, but you learn about the death of Kratos' wife and Atreus' mother, whose final wishes to Kratos and Atreus is to have her ashes scattered from atop the highest cliff in all the realms, specifically all of the 9 realms, because while the original God of War trilogy took place in ancient Greeks and is very heavily rooted in Greek mythology, the majority of all of God of War 2018 takes place in Nordic country, in a Nordic country that you can probably pinpoint exactly where it is. It's one of the Viking countries, somewhere in Scandinavia, and is heavily rooted in Norse mythology. And so Kratos' presence in the realm of Midgard, which, if you don't know your Norse mythology all that well, Midgard is what Norse mythos would call Earth. And so with Kratos' presence in Midgard, starts to attract attention from the Norse gods and goddesses, and eventually Kratos finds his way into a conflict between some of the Norse gods and goddesses, and also runs into this interesting Norse god who has no vulnerability whatsoever. He's impervious to pain, who is simply known as the Stranger at the beginning of the game. And the entire game is basically just a road trip with Kratos and his young boy Atreus. And this is the heart of this game. This game I will talk about the gameplay in a second, but I want to talk about the story to the length that I'm comfortable with talking about without talking too much spoilers. God of War is the kind of game that comes out every once in a while that honestly redefines what it means for a video game to be an interactive art form. This is the kind of game that I would argue that is technically proves that video games can indeed be an art form. For one, graphically, this is probably one of the best looking games on the PlayStation 4, period. It's a very, very photorealistic effect. There's an incredible photorealistic look to it. Every environment in Midgard, along with all the other realms, look fantastic. And there's also a great photorealism and great motion capture performances from every single voice actor as well. Kratos is played by Christopher Judge, and gosh, I forget Atreus' name. I'll look that up really quick while I talk about that. But every single one of the voice actors do a fantastic job, and all the characters are great as well. But the main anchor of God of War is the relationship between Kratos and his son. Between Kratos and his son Atreus, which I just figured out his name is Sonny Suljic, who hasn't really done very much, and he's incredibly young. He's only about 13 or so years old as of the release of this film, as of the release of this game, and both of them do a fantastic job of working together. The main focus of this game in the God of War series is to divert attention away from Kratos' bloodthirsty ways and him trying to reconcile with his dark past while trying to lead his own son down a better path than what he originally had. And there is an emotional core to God of War that is just completely spellbinding. This is one of the most emotionally rich, story-rich games that I think I've played in a very, very long time. This could easily be maybe one of my favorite story-driven games that I've played in, goodness knows, I have no idea how long. This is the kind of gameplay that really reminds me of games such as The Last of Us. The Last of Us is definitely a very similar kind of gameplay style to this game, particularly in its cinematic feel, and the realistic relationship between Kratos and Atreus. Again, there's so much I really want to talk about with this game, but I can't because there's so much story within this game. There's so many twists and turns that are all driven by heavy emotions, that's portrayed so well by the cinematic qualities of this video game and the voice acting performances of Christopher Judge and Sonny Suljic. So that's all I'm going to say about the story, because I think this is a story that you should experience for yourself. If you've never played a single God of War game, I think you can start off with this and be totally fine. It's been probably 9 years since I played my last God of War game, when God of War 3 first came out for the PlayStation 3, and I felt just right at home playing this game. So I'm going to talk about the gameplay a little bit. Like I said, this is an open-worlded adventure where you just travel around with Atreus, and there's a lot of cool, neat puzzles that allow you to work together with Atreus. Atreus has a bow and arrow that he can shoot. Throughout the game, he gets two different kinds of arrows. He gets a light arrow and he gets a shock arrow. Which the light arrows allow him to reveal different paths. The shock arrows allow him to explode certain parts of the landscape. While Kratos also has two different weapons, that's a little bit of a spoiler. He has two different weapons. He has his Leviathan axe, which is an ice-based weapon, which is good for freezing enemies, and also is good for which also can be used as a projectile, which again you can use for the different puzzles as well. There's also a fire-based weapon that I don't want to talk about. But not only that, but there's also a deep RPG element to this game as well, where you have to level up your equipment, where you can do different kinds of crafting methods. You can meet together with these two different dwarves, Sindri and Brock, who are competing to see who could be the best dwarven blacksmith in all of Midgard. and they're always willing to help you upgrade your axe, upgrade your weapon, upgrade Atreus's bow, and then upgrade the different kinds of equipment that you get throughout the game as well. And so there is a lot of variety to the game, which you will definitely use if you're playing the game on a higher difficulty. I went the normal route, and the game did provide a little bit of a challenge. There is some good difficulty curves, but it isn't too terribly challenging. If you were to play this on a harder difficulty, though, I can easily see you really, really, really needing to rely on all these different weapons. Besides that, as I said, the graphics looked amazing, and the music is also fantastic as well. It's a very, very short soundtrack. There's only about 22 tracks throughout the game, which is interesting because, again, this is I think about a 20-hour game. I think it took me about 20 hours or so to finish it. But the soundtrack is written by Barry McCree, who's well known for the remake of Battlestar Galactica and also the zombie television series The Walking Dead. Barry McCree does fantastic work. There's some great choir work. Orchestral work, and one of the best, probably easily one of the best themes throughout the game is the theme of the game itself, God of War. The name of the track is called God of War, which uses its original motif as a Gregorian kind of chant that really, really does give you a feel of both Kratos' original dark past, while also it's used in different motifs throughout the game, either gentler or bombastic or heroic multiple times throughout the game, and it's fantastic. This is probably one of the best video game soundtracks I've ever heard in a good long while. So I think that's all I really want to talk about with God of War. I could talk about so much more about this game, but that would require a spoiler talk. But that's kind of all. I don't want to even go into those kind of spoilers, because I think with a story-driven game like this is the kind of game that you want to get into without actually knowing it, without knowing much about what the story is. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and close out that discussion and say, yeah, I think God of War could easily be one of the best PlayStation 4 games I've ever played. Probably out of this year, it's definitely one of my favorite games I've played this year, and looking back, I kind of wish I played this in 2018 when it first came out, because I think this probably would have been my favorite game of 2018 too. So we're going to go ahead and switch gears, and I'm going to go ahead and talk about Star Wars for a bit. So as I said before, I want to go ahead and just give you a good ranking, just give you a good solid ranking of all of my favorite Star Wars movies as we lead into the last episode in the Skywalker saga, The Rise of Skywalker. So because I'm a big Star Wars geek, I always try to compartmentalize in my own head what my personal favorite Star Wars movies are, what my least favorites are, and every once in a while I always like to rewatch it, because no matter what, I think Star Wars will still remain probably one of my favorite film series of all time, even though there's actually a good chunk of the movies that I don't even necessarily like, and I don't necessarily consider to be good movies. So the Star Wars series has been one of my personal favorite series of all time, because ever since I was 4 years old and I first saw a VHS, I have first watched that VHS copies of the original trilogies, not the special editions, the original 1977, 1980, and 83 editions of Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. I have been a huge Star Wars fan. I love Star Wars, and it's almost been kind of rejuvenated because of the Disney takeover of Star Wars, and the release of the sequel trilogy. While I admit that there's a lot of different aspects of the films, of all the films that I love, and there's different aspects that I hate, altogether, I think I can say without a doubt that still this is one of my personal favorite series, and it's one of my favorite personal series to talk about, and I can't wait to talk about The Rise of Skywalker when it comes out next month, like literally next month. I think it comes out like almost a month, if not a month and a couple days from now. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it, and I'm just going to go ahead and start with ranking them from my least favorite to my most favorite. So to talk about this, I need to also kind of give the big disclaimer. These are just my opinions. Again, this is an opinion list. I know the Star Wars conversation has been a little bit on the erratic and aggressive side recently, and I just want to say that if you don't agree with this opinion list that I'm about to give you right now, that's okay. Just don't make fun of me because of it. I will not make, as long as I choose not to make fun of you for your opinions, you can respect my opinions. I will, even though I may disagree with your opinions and you disagree with my opinions, that is totally okay. Another disclaimer, I'm only going to talk about the theatrical movies that are not animated. So therefore, I'm not going to include the Star Wars The Clone Wars movie because that is just an advertisement for a much better animated series. So I'm not going to, don't expect to see the Clone Wars on here. Do not expect to see the holiday special. Please don't expect the holiday special to be on this list because you know it's going to be all the way at the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. And yeah, my least favorite movie in the entire series is Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. I think this should come as no surprise to any Star Wars fan out there. When the prequel trilogy first came out, when I was about, maybe 5 or 6 or so years old, I was super excited. I loved the original trilogy. I loved the adventures of Luke Skywalker, Leia Organa, Han Solo, Obi-Wan Kenobi, and I loved their triumphs against the evil Galactic Empire and Darth Vader. There's so much iconic moments in the original Star Wars trilogy that I was just so excited. I was so excited to get to see the prequel trilogy in theaters because this was one of the first times that I would get to see a brand new Star Wars movie in theaters. And what did I end up getting? I got space politics. I got pod racing. I got Jar Jar Binks. I got a movie with absolutely no main character. I got a movie that's incredibly dated. I got a movie that uses computer-generated effects and really narrow set design in order to mask those computer-generated effects. There is an awkwardness throughout the entire filming of Phantom Menace that it's so hard to ignore how awkwardly filmed the Phantom Menace is and how awkwardly acted it is too, which is so weird because for the most part, the majority of all the actors in this movie are great actors. You've got Liam Neeson as the Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn. You've got Ewan McGregor as a young Obi-Wan Kenobi, his Padawan learner, and then you've got Natalie Portman, who herself, she's actually a pretty decent actress, but you wouldn't believe it if you saw the prequel trilogy. There is just such an awkwardness to this prequel trilogy that's so hard to pin down, and I think it's a heavy mixture between bad performances and just the fact that George Lucas, even though he did conceptualize this entire thing. If we didn't have George Lucas, we wouldn't have Star Wars. But his creative inputs throughout all of Phantom Menace just feels so wrong, and it doesn't feel like it's the right. If looking back on it now, I remember being about 5 or so years old and thinking I had a good time with it, but then only realizing that whenever I watched the film, I just fast forwarded to the Darth Maul sequences so I could see some lightsaber fights. Everything about the pod racing bored me. I mean, it's a cool set piece and it's a cool use of special effects, but altogether, it's still not a great affair whatsoever. All those Galactic Senate meetings are pointless. That's exactly what we want to see in our space adventure, our space opera, some space politics. That's definitely interesting for a 5-year-old to watch for the first time in a Star Wars film in theaters. Yeah, so that's it for Phantom Menace. It's my least favorite film in the series. It makes me actually kind of angry whenever I watch it. It had a cool lightsaber fight at the end. That's about all I can say. The next movie on the list, which surprises even me, because going into The Rise of Skywalker, I decided to rewatch some of the prequel trilogy. I decided to rewatch it just to see how not good I remember them being. And the surprising thing is how I honestly think that Episode 2 of Attack of the Clones is slightly better than Phantom Menace, which is so weird because I honestly went throughout most of my life thinking Episode 2 was the worst movie because of its incredibly stilted romance between Hayden Christensen's Anakin Skywalker and Natalie Portman's Padme Amidala. This is one of the worst romances that you've ever seen in a film. there is no reason why you would believe that these two are together, despite the fact that, yes, they are both incredibly attractive. So there is that. Besides that, the mannerisms, the acting between them, the direction, it just doesn't work. And then, of course, all of the bad habits that were in episode 1, with poorly misused over-reliance on CGI, is always present in this film as well. So why is this film actually slightly better? And that's mostly actually because there's more Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi. If there's a bright spot in most of the prequel trilogy movies, it's the fact that Ewan McGregor does a great job at playing Obi-Wan Kenobi. He does a really good job at portraying a good, wise, a wise, strong, knowledgeable Jedi while also being a bit of a smart aleck at the same time, and I really, really enjoyed that. Honestly, whenever I watched episode 2, if I fast forward through all the Anakin and Padme moments, and I'm just left with the Obi-Wan Kenobi bits, it's actually a somewhat enjoyable movie. Episode 2 has an interesting mystery plot going on in as well that kind of films a bit film noir for the most part, which is very, very heavily influenced, obviously, by Blade Runner, because there's definitely a CGI set piece that is definitely ripped off of Blade Runner. I'm pretty sure George Lucas knew exactly what he was doing there. So yeah, I think that's it feels weird for me saying this, that I think episode 2 is better than 1, but it kind of is. I used to think 2 was the worst, but I think episode 1 may be worse. Episode 2 is at least bad in how badly it's handled, but episode 1 is just bad in how boring it is. So moving on from there, this is going to rile up some feathers, and I just don't want to talk about this for too long. Star Wars Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. Yeah, I've fallen out of love with this movie. When I first saw this movie, when it first came out back in 2016, I loved it. I really couldn't pin why I loved it. And then when I watched it again multiple times, I realized this is a very boring, depressing, meandering movie, with very unlikable, ill-defined characters that are only defined by their character traits. It's such a weird movie, because one of the defenses I've heard of this movie is that it's similar to a war movie that's based in the moment. But the problem is that this isn't based in a moment. This is the prelude to the first movie in the series. This is a part of a bigger whole, and you can't treat it no matter what way you treat it. If you try to treat it as a standalone movie, if you try to treat it as a prelude to Star Wars, to the first Star Wars, it kind of fails on both those accounts. Probably the only big main saving grace of Star Wars Rogue One, for me personally, was the last 20 minutes of the film, where you get to see the Rebel Alliance attempt to steal the Death Star plans from the Galactic Empire, so they can find out a way to fight against the super weapon that could potentially destroy planets and galaxies. That actually is a really, really neat sequence, and it also is filled with some really good cinematography. The film looks really, really good. It's just unfortunate that it's a use of style that it's a form of style over substance, and there's just not much substance to Star Wars Rogue One. Now this one might definitely rile a bit more feathers too. The next one is actually Return of the Jedi. Yeah, I didn't think this would happen, but honestly, not only is Return of the Jedi probably my least favorite in the original trilogy, it's probably about midway. It's about midway for me for the Star Wars movies as we go along. I think, now here's the thing, is that if I were to make this into a tier list of my Star Wars films, so episode 1 and episode 2 would occupy the bad tier, and then Star Wars Rogue One occupies the mediocre and boring tier, and then Return to the Jedi is kind of the okay tier. It's an okay movie because there's a lot of really, really great moments in it. This is the final culmination of Luke Skywalker trying to turn his, spoiler if you've never seen Star Wars, but the main lead, the second in command of the Galactic Empire, Darth Vader, is Luke Skywalker's father, blah, blah, blah. You guys know, if you know Star Wars, you know what that is. And Return of the Jedi, when it's doing that specific thing, it does it really well. The only problem with it is that that portion of the film is like 20 minutes of the film, which leaves you with about 2 hours of the movie that's left with a specific plot line to rescue Han Solo on Tatooine from Jabba the Hutt, which is fun, but it has no place in the movie whatsoever, and it could have easily been resolved either in a previous movie or in a movie that was in a fourth movie. This didn't have to be a trilogy, honestly. This could have been a movie all of its own. And then also, of course, the freaking Ewoks. Yeah, I'm big spoiler alert. Yeah, I don't like the Ewoks. They're stupid. It should have been Wookiees. Why would little Care Bears be able to fight against the Empire and defeat them with rocks and stones and tree stumps? Yeah, like I said, there are aspects of Star Wars films I love, and then there's aspects of them I hate, and this was one of them. So yeah, unfortunately, with Return of the Jedi, 20 minutes of what could potentially be maybe one of the best Star Wars movies ever does not completely mitigate 2 hours of meandering, boring, and annoying teddy bears. So yeah, that's it for Return of the Jedi. The next up on the list is, surprisingly for me, Solo: A Star Wars Story. So this was the box office bomb heard around the world. All the Star Wars, either the Star Wars fans who were mad at The Last Jedi decided to boycott Solo, and then all of the Star Wars fans who just didn't care much about Solo decided to boycott it too, and then everyone else was kind of left in the middle of it. And that's kind of where I'm at. I don't think Solo is a bad movie. Actually, I think honestly, for the most part, I think it's a good movie. It's a pretty decently enjoyable movie. It's a movie that does not warrant its existence whatsoever, because the origin of Han Solo that we really need to know about is what we got in the first Star Wars movie. We got all we needed to know from his personality from there, but Alden Ehrenreich does a pretty decent job throughout the entire film. The film has a it definitely has a very specific Western feel to it, which I definitely enjoyed. The direction by Ron Howard, which again, it's a little bit weird. It's unfortunate that we never got the Christopher Miller and Christopher Miller, whatever their names are. The Lord, it's a shame that we never got the Lord and Miller cut of the film, because that would have been potentially really, really hilarious. But at the same time, I think you get aspects of that in the Ron Howard cut of the film, and altogether, the film functions as a film. It's just not really, it doesn't really take any chances for a Star Wars movie, which is very ironic, because oddly enough, a lot of the Star Wars fans that I know who really disliked a movie like The Last Jedi really like Solo, and I can understand why. This is a movie that acts as a crowd pleaser to Star Wars fans, much the same way that Rogue One does. Much the same way that Rogue One kind of did. I personally think that Solo was a better film than Rogue One, because I think there's actually very, very likable characters, and probably one of the best aspects of it is easily the friendship between Han Solo and Chewbacca. I think the getting to see the genesis of that friendship together, and also the way Han Solo doesn't just like treat him like a pet. He actually just has real human conversations with him, even more human than some of the conversation between them in the original trilogy. It's really, really kind of awesome that we got to see that in this kind of movie. It's just a shame that when it comes down to it, it's kind of a bland, serviceable film that still is pretty mostly enjoyable. So next, we're going to go into what I would maybe consider the really good Star Wars movies, which at this point is only occupied by one movie, and that's Star Wars Revenge of the Sith, Episode 3. Now, this should be a no-brainer to anyone that, yes, there is one good prequel trilogy movie, and that is Revenge of the Sith. And I would actually posit the opinion that Revenge of the Sith would be an even better movie if it was a completely silent movie. Unfortunately, Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, has almost every single one of the same problems that Episode 2 and Episode 1 has. Very stilted dialogue, very iffy acting performances, particularly from Hayden Christensen and Natalie Portman, and even from some of the better actors in the movies, such as Samuel L. Jackson, Christopher Lee, and Ewan McGregor. They sometimes can fall victim to the very, very awkward dialogue. But what the film does a really good job with is some great visual storytelling. There is actually some really, 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 really strong visual storytelling throughout Revenge of the Sith. That if this film was entirely a silent movie with no dialogue, for the most part, you would get almost every single emotion going throughout this entire film. You would if you were able to just detach the dialogue away from it, detach the stilted delivery, and just look at it from a visual perspective, the fall of Anakin Skywalker into the Dark Lord of the Sith, Darth Vader, is completely and utterly compelling, and it works for this movie. There are aspects of this film that really, really, really work, and it's mostly because, actually, surprisingly, of Hayden Christensen's physical delivery. While some of his emotional delivery and his line reading may not be the greatest, but at the same time, for the most, he not only looks the part, but his physical acting is great too. His character acting is fantastic. And visually, again, this is one of the better films in the series. There's some great set pieces, surprisingly. This is one of the films that does use a little bit of over-reliance on CGI, but naturally, since it is the latest in the prequel trilogy, it doesn't look nearly as dated. And there's also some really, really interesting cinematographic choices throughout the film that I do appreciate a lot. Particularly, there's this one sequence between Anakin Skywalker and Padme when they're in opposite ends of a building in the Senate planet of Coruscant that I really, really enjoyed because it's just mostly silent. It's just them character acting, and that's fantastic. So yeah, Revenge of the Sith, not great by any means, but it's still actually a pretty decently good movie, and very surprisingly so, given the pedigree of the prequel trilogy. So here we go. We actually are pretty much jumping up in a tier, and this is where we get into the great Star Wars films, which is only occupied by 2 movies, and the placement of all these movies is going to ruffle some feathers. So here we go. The next film is Star Wars. Just Star Wars. I don't like calling it Episode 4. I don't like calling it A New Hope. Ever since I was 4, I had just known it as Star Wars. This is it. This is the one that started it all. Is it a perfect movie? No, of course not. Everyone keeps on talking about the fact that the prequel trilogy has really, really, really bad acting, but so did the original Star Wars. Mark Hamill was whiny as Luke Skywalker. Carrie Fisher would always pretend to have a fake British accent throughout most of it. I think probably the only 2 Han Solo, Harrison Ford as Han Solo would goof around a bit. In his performance as well. I think the only actor who was taking the entire movie seriously, surprisingly, was Sir Alec Guinness as older Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is very surprising given how much he dislikes being associated with Star Wars. But this is it. This is the big Star Wars movie. This is the big movie that pushed visual effects in Hollywood to the next level. And it's unfortunate that we can't see that original version anymore legally, unfortunately. I'm not going to tell you how you can watch it. I don't want to tell you how you can watch the original version, unless you have VHS tapes. But the only versions we have of the original trilogy as originally intended are in VHS format or Laserdisc format, because the editions that George Lucas and Disney keep on pumping out at us, they're just the Blu-ray versions with all the edits of the special editions and all more of the edits, which is upsetting to me It's upsetting me as a fan of film, because Star Wars was nominated for multiple different Academy Awards and won them. It won for Best Film Editing, for Best Sound Design, for Best Sound Effects, for Best Sound Mix, Sound Design and Mixing are the same, for Sound Mixing, for Best Film Editing. That's a big thing, especially for Star Wars, because a lot of people believe that Star Wars was a film that was saved because of its editing. As everyone knows, as a lot of people in the Star Wars bubble know, the filming of Star Wars, the original movie, was a complete and total disaster, and was only because of the editing of George Lucas's then wife that helped save the film. And it's unfortunate because we'll never get to see that version. Maybe we will at some point. It sucks. That's maybe one of the reasons why this is so low down here, because it's been such a long time since I've seen that original version, and now all we have is this tainted version that can't even be looked at in a vacuum. It's just something that always is tinkered with multiple times over. So other than that, yeah, I mean, besides the datedness of the movie, this is still one of the best science fiction films of all time. This is still one of the best films of all time, and it's one of the most influential movies of all time. It's personally, for me, just maybe it's my fourth favorite Star Wars film. And then there's my third favorite Star Wars film, which, oh boy, here we go. Yeah, it's a movie from the sequel trilogy, Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Oh boy, we're ruffling some feathers here. Yeah, I love The Last Jedi. The Last Jedi was a film that I didn't really know what to think of it when I first saw it, back in 2017 when it first came out. I saw it the opening night, and I liked so much of it. And then when the film ended, I just thought to myself, this is going to... I knew even then, after getting out of that film at around 8 o'clock at night, or around 9:30 at night, that this was going to be a movie that was going to divide a lot of people. Because The Last Jedi makes a lot of chances. The Last Jedi asks multiple questions about the legacy of certain characters in the Star Wars franchises, the roles that their legacy have played, how important that actual legacy is supposed to be. And it just asks some very, very great philosophical questions of what it means exactly to be a Star Wars film, honestly. This is honestly the kind of movie that Star Wars kind of needed, because it's the sort of movie that actually kind of gets you asking some of the questions of, okay, what actually makes all the other films great? And that in itself, the conversation, because of The Last Jedi, I think it's good. I think it's still good to have that conversation of how much of an impact Last Jedi has. Are there some problems with the film? Yeah, there's some pacing issues, definite pacing issues. Some of the writing's a little bit iffy, particularly a lot of the humor, which surprisingly I did laugh quite a few times when I first saw it in theaters, a few times, and even now if I were to watch it by myself, there's several moments in the movie that get a good hearty chuckle out of me. But yeah, I mean, besides that, the fact that Lucasfilm decided to give the second film in your sequel trilogy, which was following up on a movie that left so many mysteries open with no idea what to do with them, and just handed off to this one guy, Rian Johnson, who had only directed his independent films originally, who had directed a couple science fiction films, who had directed 2 of the best episodes of Breaking Bad, and then just give him not just directorial credit, but full writing credit to make his own Star Wars film, is actually kind of impressive, because this is definitely a film that is a certain person's vision. And whether or not you agree with Rian Johnson's view of Star Wars, that's up to you. I'm just glad that we kind of live in a world where this is the kind of Star Wars movie that can actually get made, though. So with that, I think I don't want to talk too much about The Last Jedi, because I can go on for days about how much I really do appreciate it from a filmmaking perspective. But my next favorite film in the franchise is super weird, especially knowing what my number 4 is, and that's Star Wars: The Force Awakens. So Star Wars: The Force Awakens, the first episode in the sequel trilogy of Disney's Star Wars, begins our story of the junk trader Rey, the stormtrooper turned resistance fighter Finn, and then also the return of a lot of our favorite characters, such as Han Solo, Leia Organa, C-3PO, R2-D2, the brand new droid BB-8, and then of course the leader of the First Order, the remnants of the Galactic Empire, Kylo Ren, who himself has a bit of a legacy as well, which again, like I said, those legacies get tested in The Last Jedi. So there's so much to love about The Force Awakens, but the only way I can really accurately describe it is to describe how I felt like when I was first watching it. To be able to see a new Star Wars movie after so long with there being no Star Wars movie whatsoever, and yet being able to watch this movie in theaters and to recapture the kind of feelings that I had when I first saw the original Star Wars for the first time ever, that's something that I don't think could ever be topped. I think that's something that is the kind of attachment that I have to The Force Awakens. This is the kind of movie that not only, I know a lot of people would argue that yes, it is a carbon copy of the same kind of plot line that A New Hope does. But here's the thing, I think Force Awakens does what A New Hope does much, much better. Rey's a much more clearly defined protagonist than Luke is. Every other character's more well defined. Obviously, in terms of practical effects, it looks better. Special effects, it looks better. In terms of performance wise, everything across the board is fantastic. The direction by J.J. Abrams is sleek, it's stylish, and yet it fits perfectly for the Star Wars franchise. Kylo Ren is a much, much more developed villain than Darth Vader was in the original Star Wars, which, again, that's the thing, and people rarely forget that, yeah, Darth Vader was just a guy in a helmet, he had a red lightsaber in the original Star Wars. He wasn't the big cultural icon that he would soon be in the next film I'm going to talk about, which is my favorite Star Wars movie of all time. But with that said, I think The Force Awakens gets a bad rap, because if you were to look at this film in a vacuum, what you'd be able to see is a incredibly well-crafted, fantastic, fun space adventure that is exactly the kind of Star Wars movie that we deserve. And so with that, my favorite Star Wars film of all time is Star Wars The Empire Strikes Back. What more can I really say about this film? This is one of my favorite films of all time. This is the best Star Wars movie of all time. This is probably maybe the best movie sequel of all time. Everything about the original Star Wars that was good got ramped up to 11 in this, including a new, darker, sinister tone that actually is more indicative for how the rest of the series would turn out. The tone of a Star Wars movie that was started in the original Star Wars was not really continued. Most Star Wars films after The Empire Strikes Back tried to replicate the kind of tone that Empire would do, but they never quite were able to top it. And that's exactly what Empire does. It deepens the lore. It deepens the lore of Star Wars incredibly. It gives Luke Skywalker It gives Luke Skywalker all the much needed character development he needed in order to become a Jedi Knight, to train under the ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi, to train under the greatest Jedi Master living at that time, the great Master Yoda. The surprise at Yoda being such a small little green creature, despite the fact that he's the greatest Jedi Master living at that point in time, was a great joy to behold the first time whenever I saw it. There are so many moments in Empire Strikes Back that I still think are some of the best in filmmaking, period. And as far as pop culture filmmaking goes, I don't think there's any film better than it. That's it. I really can't say anything more good things about Empire Strikes Back without actually just talking about the film at length, but that's not what I decided to do. So I'm going to go ahead and close up that discussion. So there you go. There's all Star Wars ranked from bottom to top. Phantom Menace, Episode 2, Rogue One, Return of the Jedi, Solo, Revenge of the Sith, Star Wars, The Last Jedi, The Force Awakens, and The Empire Strikes Back. So hopefully when we get back to this next week, I can maybe include Rise of Skywalker in there. I don't know where it's going to be. I'm interested. I'm hoping that Rise of Skywalker can follow through on the impressive strides that I think The Last Jedi did. I'm hoping that they don't waffle on it, but we'll have to see. So yeah, other than that, thank you guys so much for listening in. This episode went a lot longer than I thought it was going to, but that's okay. But thank you so much for listening in. Again, if you like what you see here, make sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell icon if you're using a mobile device. That way you know whenever the episode comes out, Friday. I'm going to keep on telling myself that. It comes out on Friday. Likely what's going to happen with this episode is that you're not going to see too many nice jump cuts, but that's okay. So thank you so much for listening in, and I hope to see you guys in the next episode.